Among the 20 legions of the Adeptus Astartes, few inspire the same mixture of fear, respect, and sheer bewilderment as the Space Wolves. Known by many names across the ages, the Vlka Fenryka, the Rout, the Sky Warriors of Russ, they stand as one of the Imperium's most ferocious and enigmatic fighting forces. These are warriors who hunt through the void with the same primal instinct that drives a wolf pack through winter's deepest snow. They are the executioners who answer only to the Emperor himself, the savage sons of a savage world, bearing within their very blood a curse that can transform them into monsters, yet harnessing that same curse as a weapon against humanity's enemies. Their story is one written in blood and mystery, beginning in the closing days of Terra's unification wars and stretching across 10,000 years of almost unbroken warfare. It's a tale of transformation, of a legion born from Terra's most violent outcasts, who would be reforged in the ice and fire of Fenris into something altogether more terrifying. It's the story of Leman Russ, the Wolf King, raised by literal wolves before becoming one of the Emperor's most trusted sons and most feared instruments of punishment. And it's a saga that continues even now, as the sons of Russ still wage war across a galaxy torn apart by the Great Rift, still searching for their lost Primarch, still awaiting the prophesied wolf time when all debts will be settled and all sagas will end. But to understand the Space Wolves as they exist today, we must journey back to their mysterious origins, to a time before their Primarch was found, before Fenris became their home, to the secret founding of what was known as the Trefoil. Long before the Great Crusade burst forth from the Sol system to reclaim humanity's birthright among the stars, the Emperor of Mankind laboured in the gene laboratories beneath the Himalaysian peaks. There, he crafted 20 templates for transhuman warriors, each designed with specific purposes in mind, each bearing a fragment of his own divine essence. These would become the Primarchs, and from their genetic material would spring the 20 Space Marine legions. Yet not all legions were created equal, nor were they all forged for the same purposes. While most of the proto-legions were raised openly during the final campaigns of the Unification Wars, 3 were held back, created and trained in deliberate secrecy. The 6th, the 18th, and the 20th legions, collectively known among those few who knew of their existence as the Trefoil. Each possessed gene seed that varied considerably from their brother legions, modifications that spoke to specialized purposes that the Emperor chose not to reveal even to his closest advisors. The 6th Legion's gene seed was described as singular and unique, bearing modifications that would later manifest as the Canis Helix, a genetic marker that gave the warriors of the 6th an almost feral edge. Unlike many of their brother legions who drew their initial recruits from specific regions or cultures of Terra, the 6th Legion's intake came from across the entire planet. But they were not drawn from the proud warrior castes or noble bloodlines. Instead, the recruiters sought out members of what were described as the most barbarically regressive and hyper-violent cultures and outcast groups that pre-unification Terra had produced. These were men hardened by lives of brutal survival, individuals for whom violence was not merely a tool but a way of existence. They came from forgotten tribes in irradiated wastelands, from feral gangs in the underhives, from warrior clans that had resisted unification to the bitter end. They were savage, yes, but they possessed something that the Emperor clearly valued. An adaptability, perhaps, a refusal to submit easily, a capacity for the kind of violence that could not be taught, only honed and directed. The early 6th Legion, commanded by Legion Master Enoch Rathvin, grew more slowly than many of its brother legions. This was partly by design, as the Trefoil legions were deliberately held back from full engagement during the closing stages of the Unification Wars and the early expansion into the Sol system. While other legions gained glory and recruits in the conquest of Luna and the outer planets, the 6th remained in the shadows, training, preparing, growing in isolation. But this isolation came at a cost. The gene seed of the 6th proved unstable in ways that would only become fully apparent with time. The Canis Helix, that unique genetic marker, began to manifest in disturbing ways as the first generations of the Legion aged. Warriors developed enhanced senses far beyond even the already superhuman capabilities of other Astartes. Their teeth lengthened into fangs capable of tearing through plasteel. Their aggression, already considerable, became something barely controllable. Some whispered that there was something bestial about the Legion's warriors, something that went beyond tactical ferocity into genuine savagery. More concerning still were the reports of internal fractious behaviour within the Legion. Unlike the disciplined formations of the Imperial Fists or the regimented companies of the Ultramarines, the Sixth seemed to be ruled more by the personal strength of its officers than by any formal chain of command. Violence within the ranks was said to be far too common. Factionalism threatened to tear the Legion apart before it had even truly begun its work. Yet despite these concerns, when the Sixth was finally unleashed, they proved devastatingly effective. Almost a decade after the Great Crusade had spread beyond the Sol system, the full strength of the Sixth Legion was deployed for the first time in open warfare. The target was Delsvan, designated in Imperial records as Compliance 1122, a technologically advanced human world that had met the Imperium's overtures with violence. The planet had weathered the Age of Strife relatively well, maintaining highly industrialized society governed by a militarized plutocracy dedicated to profit and political control. The Sixth Legion, numbering some 3,500 Astartes at the time, descended upon Delsvan's capital in a multi-vector planetary strike. The entire strength of Legion Master Rathvin's forces were landed within a single hour, with no reserve held back. To observers from other legions and the Imperial Army, the initial deployment appeared to follow the doctrines favoured by the Lunar Wolves, a concentrated spearhead strike designed to decapitate enemy leadership and shatter morale in one devastating blow. But what followed revealed that the Sixth were nothing like the Lunar Wolves. Where Horus's legion fought with calculated aggression and tactical brilliance, the Sixth spread through Delsvan's capital like wildfire. Chroniclers noted with alarm that they seemed to move more like a raging conflagration than an assaulting army. The resistance was not merely broken, it was utterly shattered in what witnesses described as a shocking point-blank assault of unprecedented savagery. The city fell in hours. The ruling plutocracy was torn apart, quite literally in many cases. Compliance was achieved, but at a cost in collateral damage that drew criticism from more measured Imperial commanders. Yet the Sixth Legion's reputation was now established. Over the following years, they would build upon that reputation with a string of victories that revealed them to be far more than mere savage beasts unleashed in battle. Xenos domains of the Orcs and Eldari fell before them. The worlds of Tarrales and Sahaduin were brought into compliance. On the ancient hive world of Nova Barilia, the Sixth shattered the alien tyranny of the Nomen, an enslavement that had endured for millennia. This last campaign was particularly celebrated, for it was here that an ancient battle tank standard template construct was recovered. In honour of the Sixth Legion's contribution to the campaign, and in recognition of their then unknown Primarch, the Mechanicum would name this tank pattern after him, the Leman Russ Battle Tank. By the second decade of the Great Crusade, the Sixth Legion had earned battle honours and a reputation for getting results, even if their methods remained controversial. They numbered perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 Astartes at various points during this period, a respectable size if nowhere near the strength of the largest legions. They often fought alongside other legions or supported large Imperial Army forces, their particular talents in shock assault and urban warfare making them valuable assets in major campaigns. But the gene seed instability remained a persistent concern. The effects of the Canis Helix only became more apparent over time, and without their Primarch to stabilise the genetic template, the Sixth Legion's long-term viability was increasingly questioned. Some within the Sixth itself whispered fears that they might suffer the same fate as the Third Legion had narrowly avoided, a catastrophic gene seed failure that could destroy them entirely. Then, in the second decade of the Great Crusade, everything changed. word reached Terra from the far northern reaches of the galaxy. One of the lost Primarchs had been found. On a frozen death world called Fenris, a wolf king ruled with savage majesty. The Emperor himself set course for that icy realm, and the 6th Legion's destiny was about to be transformed forever. Fenris. Even the name seems to conjure images of ice and howling wind, of endless winter and primordial savagery. A death world in every sense of the term, Fenris lies in the galactic north of Segmentum Solar, relatively close to the Eye of Terra. It is a planet of extremes, its eccentric orbit subjecting it to wild climatic variations that shift entire continents between fire and ice. During the brief Fenrisian summer, vast glaciers melt and crack, releasing ancient seas that swallow whole land masses. Mountains of ice collapse into boiling oceans. The planet itself seems to writhe and reform, and in those brief periods of stability between apocalyptic seasonal shifts, humanity clings to existence on scattered islands and hardy continental shelves. The people of Fenris are organised into tribal societies, living as their ancestors did for untold millennia, surviving through strength of arm and unyielding courage. They hunt the monstrous fauna that populate the world, creatures evolved to survive conditions that would kill lesser beasts within hours. Frost dragons, Fenrisian wolves the size of tanks, kraken lurking in the world oceans. Every day on Fenris is a battle for survival, and only the strongest, most adaptable, most ferocious humans can endure. Into this nightmarish world, an infant Primarch fell from the sky, stolen from the Emperor's laboratories by forces unknown and scattered across the galaxy along with his 19 brothers. The infant who would become Leman Russ crash-landed in the wilderness of Asahim, Fenris's largest and most stable continent. By all rights, the child should have perished within moments, frozen solid by temperatures that would shatter steel, or devoured by the countless predators that roamed the ice. Instead, he was found by wolves. Not the paltry creatures that had once roamed Old Earth, but Fenrisian wolves, massive predators whose intelligence and pack cohesion bordered on the preternatural. A she-wolf, for reasons that remain part of Fenrisian legend, chose not to kill the infant, but instead adopted him as one of her own. The child grew among the pack, nursed alongside 2 wolf brothers, whom legend would name Fricki and Geri. He learned to hunt on 4 legs before he walked upright, learned to howl before he spoke, learned to survive in conditions that would have broken the spirit of any normal human. His first encounter with humanity came when he was still young, though already growing with the accelerated development characteristic of the Primarchs. Driven by hunger, the young Russ raided food stores in a village of the Russ tribe, one of the great clan kingdoms of Asahim. King Thengir, the tribal leader, responded as any Fenrisian chieftain would, organising a hunt to eliminate the wolf pack that had dared steal from his people. The hunters fell upon the wolves with axe and spear, slaughtering them with brutal efficiency, but among the corpses they found something unexpected. A boy, wild, feral, unable to speak their language, but unmistakably human. Thengir, seeing something exceptional in the child's eyes, made a decision that would change Fenris forever. Rather than killing the wolf boy, he ordered him brought back to the tribal settlement. There, slowly, painfully, the child learned to be human again. He learned language. He mastered the use of weapons, iron axes and swords. He discovered laughter and song, loyalty and brotherhood. The boy who had been raised by wolves began to understand that he was more than wolf, more than human. He was something superior to both, and he was given a name that reflected his dual nature, Leman of the Russ, Leman Russ. The young Primarch's growth was extraordinary even by the standards of his kind. Within years rather than decades, he had become not merely a great warrior, but the greatest warrior Fenris had ever known. Tales spread across the frozen continents of his impossible feats. He could tear oak trees from the ground with his bare hands and snap them across his back. He wrestled Fenrisian mammoths to the earth. He turned back entire armies without suffering a single wound. When King Thengir died, there was no question of succession. Leman Russ took the throne, and under his rule, Fenris knew a unity it had never experienced. His court became the stuff of legend. The fiercest warlords pledged their swords to him. His mead hall rang with songs of valour and conquest, and between man and wolf an uneasy truce existed, for the wolves recognised one of their own sitting upon the throne of men. The Wolf King's fame spread like wildfire across the tribal networks, growing with each retelling until the songs of Fenris reached all the way to Terra itself. In 819 to 30, the fleets of the Great Crusade arrived in the Fenrisian system. The Emperor had heard tales of Fenris's extraordinary Wolf King and recognised immediately the work of one of his missing sons. The Emperor descended to the planet's surface, determined to reclaim this particular primarch himself. The meeting between father and son has become one of the great legends of the Imperium, though accounts vary in the telling. What is known is that Leman Russ did not immediately bend knee to this golden stranger, who arrived unannounced in his hall. The Wolf King was not one to be cowed by appearances, no matter how impressive. He demanded proof of this being's claim to authority over him. He issued challenges, tests to determine if this emperor was worthy of Russ's loyalty. The first challenge was one of eating. Russ could devour entire boar carcasses, and he challenged the emperor to match him plate for plate, cut for cut. They ate, and by most accounts the emperor was bested. The second challenge was one of drinking. The Wolf King could drain barrels of Fenrisian ale without wavering, and he challenged his visitor to match him cup for cup. They drank, and again the emperor conceded defeat. But the third challenge was different. Leman Russ, supremely confident after his victories, boasted that he could defeat the emperor in single combat. The court grew silent as Russ drew his great sword and stepped onto the feasting table. The emperor threw aside his cloak, revealing his true form. He stood far taller than any man present, swathed in golden light and clad in Baroque power armour. The Wolf King recognised, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he faced a being that might actually be his superior. They fought. For hours they battled, Russ using every trick he had learned hunting in the wilderness and warring across Fenris, the Emperor responding with millennia of martial perfection. The mead hall shook with the force of their blows. Warriors who witnessed the duel would speak of it in awed whispers for the rest of their lives. And then, finally, the Emperor struck. A single blow from his power-clad fist sent Leman Russ crashing to the floor unconscious. When the Wolf King awoke an hour later, his face bloodied and one of his fangs broken, he did something he had never done before. He admitted defeat. With a rueful smile, he swore fealty to the Emperor of Mankind, acknowledging his father and master. The reunion of Primarch and Legion happened swiftly after that. The Emperor brought Russ to meet the warriors who bore his gene seed, the 6th Legion. Russ saw in them the potential for greatness, but also recognized that they needed to be reforged, tempered in the same crucible that had shaped him. Within weeks of taking command, Russ announced that his legion would undertake a campaign that would cement their reputation forever, or destroy them in the attempt. The target was the Wheel of Fire, a sprawling wilderness region of space racked by warp storms and burning nebulae. It was home to at least a score of Xenos-occupied worlds, many under the dominion of a vast orc empire numbering perhaps 1 billion greenskins. The region had been left largely untouched because the cost of pacification was projected to be catastrophically high. Imperial strategists wanted to bypass it entirely. Leman Russ demanded the honour of taking it. The Wheel of Fire campaign lasted 5 brutal years. It was warfare at its most savage, fleet actions in the burning hearts of nebulae, followed by planetary assaults against orc strongholds that had existed since before humanity reached the stars. The 6th Legion threw themselves into the meat grinder, with the fearless aggression that would become their hallmark. They fought in void-born cold and in the firestorms of dying suns. They purged world after world, fortress after fortress, until the Orc domain was shattered and the Wheel of Fire belonged to the Imperium. But the cost was staggering. A full third of the 6th Legion fell in that campaign, including the vast majority of the remaining Terran-born Astartes, who had formed the Legion's original core. Casualties were described as frighteningly high, even by the brutal standards of the Great Crusade. When the battered survivors limped back to Fenris, the Legion numbered only 15,000 warriors. Yet those 15,000 had been transformed. In the crucible of the Wheel of Fire, the surviving Terrans and the newly inducted Fenrisians had forged bonds of brotherhood through shared suffering. The culture and martial traditions of Fenris, embodied by their Primarch, had been fully adopted by the Legion. They no longer thought of themselves as the 6th Legion, a designation of cold imperial bureaucracy. They were the Vlka Fenryka, the Wolves of Fenris, and Fenris itself was now their home. What they found waiting for them upon their return made clear just how much the Emperor valued his wolves. During the Legion's absence, one of the mightiest citadels ever built during the Great Crusade had been constructed on Fenris. The Fang, carved into and rising from the tallest peak on Asserheim, plunged deep into the world's crust and soared so high that its uppermost spires breached the atmosphere itself. It was a fortress monastery beyond compare, equipped with gene laboratories and training facilities that would allow the Legion to rebuild its strength rapidly. More importantly, the reunion with their Primarch brought stability to the gene seed that had plagued the 6th since its inception. Leman Russ's own gene helix pattern was harvested and used to stabilize the existing gene stock, calming the impurities and mutations that had threatened the Legion's future. Combined with the natural resilience of Fenrisian stock, warriors who had survived for generations on one of the Imperium's most lethal death worlds, the transformation process became far more reliable. The Legion began its rapid expansion, drawing recruits from the tribes of Fenris through trials that tested courage, strength, and worthiness. Wolf Priests, the chapter's unique combination of chaplain, apothecary, and keeper of traditions, ventured into the wilderness to identify potential candidates. Those chosen faced the cup of Wulfen, drinking from a sacred chalice that contained the genetic cocktail needed to activate their gene seed implants. Many died in the transformation. Some few degraded into Wulfen, feral monsters more beast than man. But those who survived emerged as something magnificent and terrible. Space wolves, the Emperor's executioners, ready to take their place in the Great Crusade. The space wolves that emerged from the crucible of the Wheel of Fire were a Legion transformed, and the galaxy would soon learn to fear the sound of their howls. Under Leman Russ's command, the 6th Legion became one of the most formidable and distinctive forces in the Emperor's arsenal. They were not the largest Legion, their numbers hovering between 95,000 and 130,000 Astartes at their peak, roughly mid-sized compared to behemoths like the Ultramarines or Wordbearers. But size was not what made the Space Wolves exceptional. It was their role, their methods, and the utter loyalty they displayed to the master of mankind. The Space Wolves operated with a freedom that few other legions enjoyed. Their expeditionary fleets and task forces went where they willed, fought where they willed, and undertook only those requests for aid that Leman Russ and his warlords saw fit to honour. High Commanders and Lords Solar of the Imperium quickly learned not to try issuing orders to the Wolves. The 6th Legion heeded only one commander, their Primarch, and Leman Russ acknowledged only one overlord, the Emperor himself. In this loyalty they were adamant and unshakable, caring little for the good opinion of any other, be they Primarch, Planetary Governor or High Lord. This independence came from a special relationship between Russ and his father. While other Primarchs led legions in the wars of expansion, conquering new worlds and expanding the Imperium's borders, the Space Wolves were kept under the tight control of the Imperial Court and unleashed at the Emperor's command for very specific purposes. They served as often to chastise those who would renege on oaths of service, as to destroy those who resisted compliance on the Dark Frontier. They were the bloody-handed tool of punishment, the sanction force that answered directly to Terra. In this role, the Space Wolves earned a title that would follow them throughout their history, the Emperor's Executioners. When a world needed to be made an example of, when a rebellion needed to be crushed so thoroughly that the very memory of resistance would be scoured from the survivors, when those who had sworn loyalty to the Imperium broke their oaths, the Space Wolves were unleashed. Their campaigns were unsubtle but brutally swift, calculated exercises in ferocity designed to tear and rend until the foe lay in ruins or was driven to its death. The visible campaigns of the Space Wolves during the Great Crusade were impressive enough. They fought in the Rangdan Xenocides, that nightmarish series of wars against an alien threat so terrible that it nearly destroyed the Northern Imperium entirely. Alongside the Dark Angels and other legions, the Space Wolves helped turn back a Xenos empire that could have ended the Great Crusade before it truly began. The cost was tremendous. Thousands upon thousands of Astartes' lives spent to prevent catastrophe, but the Wolves paid that price without hesitation. They participated in countless compliance actions, their reputations preceding them like a cold wind. On Nova Barilia, they had already shattered the Noman tyranny. In subsequent campaigns, they broke Orc domains and Aeldari enclaves, purged human renegades and Xenos abominations. Their tactics varied depending on need. Sometimes they deployed as a concentrated hammer blow, their great companies gathering for overwhelming shock assault. Other times they dispersed as hunter-killer packs, pursuing fleeing enemies across star systems with the tireless patience of true predators. But the campaigns known to wider Imperial history represented only a portion of the Space Wolves' activities. In the solar decades in which they made war in the Imperium's shadows, they undertook missions so dark that they were recorded only in the most secure Imperial archives, on the black basalt Memento Mori on Baal, and nowhere else. Side by side with the Blood Angels, they exterminated a fourth-stage enslaver outbreak on Poseidonis Secundus. This was one of only 3 occasions in the entire Great Crusade that an enslaver outbreak of that intensity had been defeated without resort to exterminatus. The psychic parasites that had once nearly destroyed galactic civilization during the fall of the Eldar were eradicated by the combined fury of 2 legions who understood that some threats could not be allowed to escape. Known to few but the Wolf King and his Emperor, the 6th Legion faced and bested many threats both nightmarish and arcane. They waged secret war against the Psyker Kings of Valach, godlike beings whose mastery of the warp threatened to corrupt entire star systems. They countered the insidious menace of the Lacrimara infestation of Moroks, creatures whose very nature remains classified even in the fragmentary records that survive. These victories and unknown others, conflicts so terrible they are recorded only as battle honours on the Great Bell of Terra, remain deliberately obscured from common knowledge. This secrecy, this oft-served role as instruments of punishment and executors of the Emperor's will in its darkest expressions, steadily drove a wedge between the 6th and their brother legions. Some, like the Ultramarines, maintained a distant respect for the Wolves' effectiveness, while privately considering their methods excessive. Others, particularly those legions who prized glory and honour, found the Space Wolves' willingness to undertake such grim work distasteful. The relationship between the Space Wolves and Dark Angels was particularly complex, a mixture of comradeship and rivalry that would persist for millennia. The 2 legions had shared dark passages of history, campaigns where they fought side by side against enemies that could not be allowed to survive. During a compliance action on the world of Dulan, this complex relationship came to a head in dramatic fashion. The ruler of Dulan had insulted Leman Russ's honour, and the Wolf King was determined to personally defeat the rebellious leader as recompense. However, the Dark Angels, led by their Primarch Lionel Johnson, were also present at the campaign. Both legions assaulted the rebels' fortress, and in the heat of battle, both Primarchs reached the enemy leader at the same moment. What followed was a dispute over who had truly claimed the kill, an argument that escalated until the two Primarchs came to blows. The duel between Russ and the Lion became legendary, not for its outcome but for what it revealed about both warriors. They fought for hours, neither able to gain decisive advantage, until exhaustion overcame them both. The incident established a tradition that would endure. Champions of the Space Wolves and Dark Angels would duel to settle matters of honour, a practice that acknowledged both the rivalry and the underlying respect between the legions. Not all the Space Wolves' interactions with their brother legions were so ambiguous. The Knight of the Wolf, as it came to be known, saw Leman Russ leading his warriors against the World Eaters' Legion. Angron, the Primarch of the 12th Legion, had begun performing surgical implantation of the Butcher's nails on his warriors, augmetic devices that enhanced aggression but destroyed higher cognitive function. The Emperor, horrified by this practice, ordered Russ to make Angron cease. The confrontation on the plains of an unnamed world saw the Space Wolves facing the World Eaters in what amounted to a controlled conflict, an object lesson about the limits of mere rage against disciplined fury. The World Eaters, driven by the nails, charged with berserker abandon. The Space Wolves, drawing on tactical doctrine and controlled aggression, systematically dismantled their opponents. When Angron himself faced Leman Russ, the Red Angel discovered that ferocity alone was not enough against a warrior who combined savage strength with strategic thinking. The Space Wolves also had a brief but bloody confrontation with the Thousand Sons on Archreach Secundus, a clash that foreshadowed the greater tragedy to come. Magnus the Red and Leman Russ disagreed fundamentally about the nature and use of psychic power, and this philosophical divide occasionally erupted into violence. Russ's deep-seated hatred of sorcery, born from his experiences on Fenris and reinforced by what he witnessed during the Crusade, put him at odds with Magnus's belief that psychic power could be safely harnessed and studied. Perhaps most significantly, dark hints in the record suggest the Space Wolves may have played a role in the disappearance of the two lost legions, the 2nd and 11th. Members of the Adeptus Custodes, when speaking in heavily redacted accounts, indicated that the Space Wolves were among the first responders to an act of betrayal involving the 11th Legion. What exactly occurred remains one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets, but the implication is clear. When Astartes turned against the Emperor, it was the Space Wolves who were called upon to deliver the ultimate sanction. The organisational structure of the Space Wolves during this era reflected their unique culture. Unlike the rigid company structures of other legions, the Wolves organised themselves into great companies, each led by a warrior of exceptional skill and reputation. These Jarls, as Fenrisian tradition named them, commanded their great companies with considerable autonomy, though all answered ultimately to the Wolf King. The size of great companies varied tremendously based on the Jarl's ability to attract followers and the needs of ongoing campaigns. Specialised roles existed within the Legion, adapted to Fenrisian cultural traditions. The Wolf Priests combined the functions of chaplain, apothecary and keeper of law, maintaining the Legion's gene seed while also serving as spiritual leaders and remembrancers of great deeds. The Rune Priests, despite Russ's hatred of sorcery, wielded psychic powers that they claimed came not from the warp but from the spirits of Fenris itself. Whether this distinction had any objective reality or was merely cultural rationalisation remained a matter of debate, but the Rune Priests proved devastatingly effective in combat. The Iron Priests served as the Legion's tech marines and masters of the armoury, though they remained somewhat apart from the main body of the Legion. Their loyalties divided between the Wolves and the Mechanicum that had trained them, and within the Legion's ranks moved the Wolfen, those warriors who had partially succumbed to the curse in their gene seed, but retained enough humanity to fight as controlled berserkers rather than mindless beasts. The 13th Great Company, in particular, became home to many Wolfen during this era. Where other legions would have put such afflicted warriors down or confined them, the Space Wolves understood the value of controlled savagery. The 13th Company became a force of barely restrained fury, deployed where the enemy needed not merely to be defeated but utterly terrified. They were a reminder that the curse within the Space Wolves' blood could be both weapon and weakness, a duality that defined the Legion. By the closing decades of the Great Crusade, the Space Wolves had firmly established themselves as one of the Imperium's most effective, if controversial, legions. Their strength stood at somewhere between 95,000 and 100,000 astartes, their ranks depleted from a peak of perhaps 130,000 by the many brutal campaigns they had undertaken. Issues with their gene seed meant they could not easily replace casualties as quickly as more stable legions, but the quality of warriors they produced was exceptional. Then came the Council of Nicaea, and with it the seeds of the greatest tragedy the Space Wolves would face. The Council of Nicaea, convened in the early decades of the 3rd century of the Great Crusade, stands as one of the pivotal moments in Imperial history. Ostensibly called to debate the use of psychic powers among the Legion's astartes, it became something far more. It was a trial, though one side did not realise it was the accused until too late, and it set in motion events that would see brother turned against brother, legion against legion, in an act of violence that would echo across 10,000 years. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, stood at the centre of the controversy. He and his legion had delved deeply into the study of the warp and sorcery, convinced that psychic power could be safely harnessed through knowledge and discipline. They saw themselves as enlightened scholars, pushing the boundaries of understanding to better serve the Imperium. Others saw them as arrogant fools playing with forces they could not truly control, courting damnation in their hubris. Leman Russ spoke against Magnus at the council with a vehemence that surprised many observers. The Wolf King's hatred of sorcery was well known, but the intensity of his opposition suggested something deeper. He argued that psychic powers were inherently corrupting, that they opened doors that should remain forever sealed. The powers Magnus claimed to command with such confidence were, in Russ's view, nothing more than bargains with entities that would inevitably demand payment in souls. The Emperor, after hearing arguments from both sides, issued his decree. The use of psychic sorcery was forbidden. The librarious programs that had been established in many legions were to be disbanded. Psykers could serve in specific roles sanctioned by the Imperium, but the study and practice of sorcery as Magnus and his 1,000 sons pursued it was declared anathema. Magnus left Nicaea bitter and resentful, convinced he had been unjustly condemned by those who could not comprehend the subtleties of what he had achieved. But Magnus's greatest transgression was yet to come. While meditating on his homeworld of Prospero, the Crimson King peered into the future using forbidden techniques and witnessed a horrifying vision. His brother Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's most favoured son, was about to betray the Imperium and plunge the galaxy into civil war. Magnus saw Horus's corruption, saw the plans being laid, and knew he had to warn the Emperor immediately. Unable to reach Terra in time through conventional means, and convinced that only through psychic sorcery could he deliver his warning quickly enough, Magnus did the one thing the Emperor had explicitly forbidden him to do. He delved into the warp, gathering power until he had amassed enough to cast his consciousness across the galaxy to Terra itself. He smashed through every ward and protection the Emperor had placed around the Imperial Palace, breached defences that had been crafted over millennia, and delivered his warning directly into his father's throne room. But in doing so, Magnus destroyed something infinitely precious. Unbeknownst to him, the Emperor had been working on a secret project beneath the Imperial Palace, a webway gate that would have allowed humanity to travel the galaxy without relying on the warp. Magnus's psychic assault shattered the protections around this project, opening a rift directly into the webway that began pouring demons into the palace itself. The Emperor, rather than preparing to confront Horus's betrayal, was forced to abandon all his other plans to hold this breach closed, lest Terra itself fall to demonic invasion. The Emperor's rage was terrible to behold. Magnus had not only disobeyed a direct command, he had done so in a way that destroyed one of the greatest hopes for humanity's future, and revealed himself to have been practicing the very sorcery he had promised to renounce. The Emperor called forth Leman Russ and gave him a mission: go to Prospero, apprehend Magnus the Red, and bring him back to Terra to face judgment for his crimes. Russ gathered his forces with grim purpose. Within a month, the Space Wolves had assembled in fleet strength, loading their ships with the kind of weapons typically reserved for sector-wide purgation operations. They armed for total war, drawing on the Ordo Reductor's most prescribed munitions and ammunition. When Constantine Valdor of the Adeptus Custodes arrived, with the Terran elements of what was designated the Censure Host, including thousands of custodians and Sisters of Silence, he noted with alarm that the wolves appeared to be preparing for another Rangdan Xenocide. This seemed excessive for a mission to apprehend one Primarch and return him for judgment. But Russ's orders were about to change. Horus Lupercal, already deep in his betrayal though not yet revealed as a traitor, sent updated instructions to the Space Wolves. The War Master had learned of Magnus's psychic assault and saw an opportunity to further divide the Imperium against itself. The message Horus sent to Russ reframed the mission entirely. Magnus was not to be apprehended, he was to be executed, and Prospero itself was to be destroyed as an example of what happened to those who defied the Emperor's will. Whether Russ needed much convincing is a matter of debate. The Wolf King had long harboured suspicions about Magnus, and the evidence of the Crimson King's disobedience seemed to confirm Russ's worst fears. The Space Wolves, already loading their ships with weapons of mass destruction, prepared to become instruments of annihilation. The Censure Host arrived at Prospero in early Aura 4, M31, the fleet translating into the system with weapons already charged and shields at full strength. They expected resistance, expected to find Magnus's fleet deployed in defensive positions, ready to contest any attempt to reach the planet. Instead, they found nothing. No fleet in orbit, no defensive batteries firing, no communication from Prospero except eerie silence. The Space Wolves and their allies took up orbit and began what they had come to do. Saturation orbital bombardment commenced across the entire planet, torpedoes and lance strikes turning the surface into a hellscape of fire and ruin. Entire cities were vaporized in the opening minutes. The bombardment was so sudden and so overwhelming that only one population centre survived. Tizca, the capital city protected by a telekinetic shield, generated by the Thousand Suns Raptora cult. Even this defence cost lives, the sympathetic psychic damage killing several of the maintainers as they held back enough firepower to level continents. The Thousand Suns who survived the initial bombardment were in a state of confusion and horror. They had received no warning, no declaration of intent, nothing to explain why they were under attack. When they finally reached Magnus for guidance, he told them something that broke their spirits. He ordered them not to resist. He commanded them to accept their deaths with honour, to allow the Space Wolves to do what they had come to do. Magnus, racked with guilt over his mistake, had decided that he and his legion deserved this punishment. But Magnus had underestimated his sons. The Thousand Suns refused to simply lie down and die. They rallied, organised their defences and prepared to fight for their lives and their world. The Space Wolves made planetfall in a massive assault, deploying from orbit in drop pods and stormbirds, accompanied by custodians and Sisters of Silence. The battle for Tizca began, and it would be remembered as one of the most savage fratricidal conflicts of the age. The Space Wolves fought with the controlled fury that had become their hallmark, every pack working in coordination, flushing out defenders and eliminating them with brutal efficiency. The Thousand Suns, for all their psychic might, found their powers nullified by the Sisters of Silence, or torn apart by the Space Wolves' rune priests. Sorcerer lords who could level buildings with a thought were dragged down by Wolfguard and torn apart. The pyramids and libraries of Tizca, repositories of knowledge gathered over centuries, burned as the Space Wolves systematically demolished everything they found. At the heart of the city, Leman Russ and Magnus the Red finally faced each other. The two Primarchs could not have been more different. Russ, clad in battle plate and wielding weapons designed for war, embodied martial fury tempered by tactical genius. Magnus, towering in his psychic might, represented the power of the mind unleashed, sorcery wielded with devastating effect. They clashed amid the ruins of Prospero, and the very planet seemed to shake with the force of their duel. Magnus, fighting with the desperate fury of one who had lost everything, battered Russ with fists wreathed in lightning and fire. He turned the moat around his pyramid to bubbling acid, slaying or wounding all who tried to cross it. He summoned shadowy hands from pools of water to drag warriors to their doom. The warp storm in the sky above intensified as Magnus drew upon more and more power. For a time, it seemed as though the Crimson King might actually prevail. But Leman Russ had not come alone, and he had not come unprepared. The Sisters of Silence advanced, their null fields dampening Magnus's powers. The Custodians cut through Thousand Suns who tried to reinforce their Primarch. And Russ himself, wielding the Spear of Russ, a weapon blessed by the Emperor himself, pressed his advantage. The battle between the two Primarchs became a brutal contest of endurance and will. Finally, Russ landed a devastating blow, the Spear of Russ driven into Magnus's chest. The psychic feedback from the wound shattered Magnus's physical form, and in desperation, the Crimson King used his remaining power to cast a great working. He teleported himself and the survivors of his legion away from Prospero, tearing them through the warp to the planet of the sorcerers within the Eye of Terra. In doing so, Magnus shattered his own body and became the first demon Primarch, his physical form destroyed and replaced with a being of pure warp energy. The Space Wolves, having completed their mission, enacted exterminatus on what remained of Prospero and left it a dead world. But the cost had been catastrophic. The Thousand Suns had lost perhaps 90% of their legion strength. The survivors, feeling utterly betrayed by the Emperor they had served, turned to Horus's rebellion, convinced that the Imperium had become a tyranny that feared and hated them for their gifts. The Space Wolves too paid a terrible price. Some 25,000 Astartes were listed as killed in combat, with several thousand more of the 13th Great Company simply listed as missing, having pursued surviving Thousand Suns into the warp and vanished. These casualties constituted a substantial portion of the Legion's total strength, and coming as it did mere months before the formal outbreak of the Horus Heresy, the Space Wolves had little chance to replenish their numbers. Just as serious was the expenditure of munitions and equipment. The Wolves had prosecuted the war on Prospero with such zeal that their reserves were badly depleted, leaving them unable to engage in more than limited warfare during the early stages of the heresy. And there was a deeper wound, one that would fester for 10,000 years. Leman Russ, in the aftermath of Prospero, came to realize that he had been manipulated. Magnus's crime had been real, his disobedience genuine, but the orders to execute him rather than apprehend him had come from Horus, not the Emperor. Russ had been turned into the instrument of Horus's betrayal, used to eliminate a legion that might have remained loyal if offered mercy instead of annihilation. The knowledge ate at the Wolf King, a guilt that would never fully heal. The burning of Prospero stands as one of the great tragedies of the Horus Heresy, a moment when two loyal legions were turned against each other through manipulation and misunderstanding, when the Emperor's sons destroyed each other while the true enemy laughed and prepared his final gambit. And for the Space Wolves, it was the beginning of a long road of regret and redemption that continues to this day. The Space Wolves, bloodied and depleted from Prospero, found themselves in a difficult position when the Horus Heresy erupted into open warfare. They had lost perhaps a quarter of their strength in the assault on the Thousand Suns, and their supply situation was dire. Yet when Horus's betrayal became known, there was never any question of where Leman Russ's loyalties lay. The Wolf King and his warriors would stand with the Emperor until the end, whatever that end might be. In the early stages of the heresy, the Space Wolves found themselves scattered across the galaxy, their great companies engaged in various campaigns when the call came to muster at Terra. Russ, tormented by his role in driving the Thousand Sons to Horus's banner, became convinced that it was his destiny to confront the Warmaster directly. Against the advice of Rogel, Dawn and Sanguinius, who wanted him to return to Terra for the coming siege, Russ led his forces in pursuit of Horus, determined to end the war through a decapitation strike. Thanks to intelligence gathered by the Knights Errant, Russ was able to track the location of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship. But before engaging the Warmaster, the Wolf King returned to Fenris to conduct a ritual with his rune priests, seeking to ascertain a weakness in Horus that could be exploited. This ritual revealed something profound and terrible about the nature of the Primarchs and their relationship to the Emperor, knowledge that would haunt Russ for the remainder of his life. Armed with the Spear of Russ, now understood to hold a portion of the Emperor's own power, the Space Wolves confronted Horus. The details of this engagement remain fragmentary, but what is known suggests it was a near-catastrophic failure. The Warmaster, empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods, proved far more powerful than even Leman Russ could have anticipated. The Space Wolves were battered and nearly destroyed, and Russ himself was gravely wounded. After this failed attempt to kill Horus, the Space Wolves eventually made their way to Terra, arriving just as the siege was beginning. They fought in the defence of the Imperial Palace, their depleted numbers still making a significant contribution to the desperate battles that raged across the throne world. When Horus finally fell and the Emperor was entombed upon the Golden Throne, the Space Wolves joined in the great hunt for the traitor legions as they fled into the Eye of Terror. But for Leman Russ, the victory rang hollow. He had been manipulated into attacking Prospero. His attempt to kill Horus had failed spectacularly. The Emperor he had served with such absolute loyalty now sat paralysed upon the Golden Throne, unable to speak, unable to lead. Russ returned to Fenris a changed man, openly challenging the wisdom of decisions made in the Emperor's name, expressing regret for Prospero, questioning the shape of the Imperium that was emerging from the heresy's ashes. In the years after the heresy, as the Imperial Reformation restructured the Legiones Astartes, the Space Wolves faced a difficult decision. Roboute Guilliman's Codex Astartes mandated that all legions be divided into chapters of roughly 1,000 warriors, preventing any one leader from commanding the same massive forces that had allowed Horus to nearly destroy the Imperium. Most legions complied, if sometimes reluctantly. The Space Wolves resisted. Leman Russ argued that his legion's unique gene seed made it impossible to create multiple chapters. The Canis Helix was too unstable, too dependent on the harsh selection pressures of Fenris to work reliably elsewhere. Eventually a compromise was reached. The Space Wolves would create one successor chapter, the Wolf Brothers, as proof of their willingness to comply with the spirit of the Codex, but this would be their only division. The Wolf Brothers' fate seemed to prove Russ correct. Within a few generations, the new chapter began experiencing catastrophic gene seed instability. The curse of the Wolfen manifested with far greater frequency than in the parent chapter. Mutations ran rampant. Eventually, the Wolf Brothers were quietly disbanded, their gene seed destroyed, and the Space Wolves have remained the only chapter drawn from Leman Russ's genetic legacy for 10,000 years. In 211 M31, during a great feast with his legion in attendance, Leman Russ stood and spoke words that would become legend. "In the end I will return," he said, "for the final battle, for the Wolf time." He then departed the Fang, accompanied by his personal retinue with the sole exception of Bjorn the Fell-Handed, who remained on Fenris as Great Wolf. Russ and his warriors embarked into the Eye of Terror and vanished from history. The tale of his disappearance is retold every 1,000 years by Bjorn, who remains to this day the oldest dreadnought in the Imperium, a living link to the time when Leman Russ walked among his sons. Many within the Space Wolves believe that Russ has sought the Tree of Life, a legendary artifact that might restore the Emperor to health. Magnus the Red apparently knows the Wolf King's whereabouts, but keeps it secret, one final act of spite against the brother who destroyed his legion. In Russ's absence, the Space Wolves have continued to wage war across the galaxy. Every so often, they embark on what is called the Great Hunt, searching for their lost Primarch. Though they have never found definitive signs of Russ, strange omens and visions occasionally guide them to artifacts connected to their Gene Father, or to battlefields where intervention by an unknown force has turned the tide in ways that suggest the wolf, King's Hand. The Space Wolves have participated in countless campaigns over the 10 millennia since the Heresy. They fought in the First War for Armageddon, where Logan Grimnar led 300 Space Wolves alongside Grey Knights against Angron and a demonic horde. In the months of shame that followed, the Space Wolves came into conflict with the Inquisition itself when they moved to protect Imperial Guard and civilians from Armageddon from inquisitorial purges. At the conflict's peak, Fenris itself was besieged, but the Space Wolves refused to back down, establishing a reputation for defying authority when they believed that authority to be in the wrong. Logan Grimnar, who has served as Great Wolf for over 800 years as of the end of the 41st millennium, exemplifies the Space Wolves' enduring character. He is a warrior of legendary prowess, a leader who inspires absolute loyalty and a voice of reason and conscience even when it puts him at odds with the wider Imperium. Under his leadership, the Space Wolves have remained true to their traditions while adapting to the changing needs of a galaxy in perpetual crisis. The opening of the Great Rift and the return of Roboute Guilliman in the early 42nd millennium presented the Space Wolves with new challenges. The chapter had been badly depleted by a series of catastrophic conflicts: the Third War for Armageddon, the hunt for the Wolfen, and the siege of the Fenris system. When Guilliman's torchbearer fleets arrived bearing Primaris Space Marines, warriors created from Leman Russ's gene seed using new processes developed by Archimagos Belisarius Cole, Grimnar was deeply suspicious. These new warriors were not of Fenris. They had not proven themselves in the chapter's traditional trials. They represented change being imposed from outside by a Primarch who the Space Wolves saw as the architect of the Codex Astartes, the document they had resisted for 10,000 years. Some within the chapter feared that Guilliman sought to control the Space Wolves, to finally force them into compliance with his vision of what Space Marines should be. A summit was held at the Fang between Grimnar and Guilliman. The details of what was discussed remain private, but the outcome was clear. The Space Wolves accepted the Primaris reinforcements, recognizing that the chapter's survival might depend on these fresh warriors, but they did so on their own terms, inducting the Primaris into their existing Great Company structure and ensuring they learned the ways of Fenris. The Space Wolves would evolve, but they would not be transformed into something they were not. The Space Wolves stand now as they have always stood, apart from their fellow chapters, defiant of authority save that which they freely choose to acknowledge, savage in their fury yet bound by codes of honour that run deeper than mere regulation. They are the wolves that hunt in the void, the executioners who carry out the Imperium's darkest necessities, the inheritors of a legacy that stretches back to the very dawn of the Great Crusade. From their mysterious founding as one of the Trefoil Legions, through their transformation under Leman Russ's leadership, to their role as the Emperor's sanctioned force during the Great Crusade, the Space Wolves have carved a saga written in the blood of the Imperium's enemies. They have faced nightmares that would break lesser warriors, fought wars that could never be spoken of, and paid prices that would be remembered forever. The Burning of Prospero remains the great tragedy of their history, a wound that has never fully healed, a reminder that even the most loyal can be manipulated into serving the enemy's ends. But from that tragedy they learned hard lessons about the cost of absolute certainty, about the need to question even those orders that seem to come from the highest authority. In the 10,000 years since Leman Russ disappeared into the Eye of Terra, the Space Wolves have continued his work. They have defended the Imperium with a ferocity that few can match, maintaining traditions that stretch back to the tribal societies of Fenris, while adapting to meet the challenges of an evolving galaxy. They have clashed with the Inquisition, with other chapters, even with their own successors, whenever they believed that justice and honour demanded it. The curse in their blood, the Canis Helix that makes them more than human but risks making them less than human as well, remains both their greatest weakness and their unique strength. The Wulfen, those warriors who succumb to the beast within, serve as a reminder that savagery without control is merely madness. But they also demonstrate that the Space Wolves can harness even their darkest aspects in service of the Imperium. As the galaxy burns in the aftermath of the Great Rift's opening, as new horrors emerge from the warp and ancient enemies grow bold, the Space Wolves continue their eternal hunt. They fight in the Emperor's name, yes, but also in the name of Leman Russ, awaiting the prophesied wolf time when their Primarch will return to lead them in the final battle. Whether that return will ever come, whether the wolf time is genuine prophecy or mere legend, none can say. But the Sons of Russ will be ready when it does. They will have their sagas to tell, their great deeds recorded in song and story, their honour intact and their fury undiminished. They are the Space Wolves, the Vlka Fenryka, the rout who answer to no one save their own, and they will endure as they have always endured, through strength of arm and strength of will, until the stars themselves grow cold. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the complete history of the Space Wolves, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Obsidian Scriptorium for more comprehensive lore explorations. Drop a comment below with your favourite moment from Space Wolves history, or let me know which legion or chapter you'd like me to cover next. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future there is only war, but there will always be wolves in the dark, hunting the Emperor's enemies, for Russ, for the Wolf Time, for the All-Father,